In the Second Age, Sauron infamously handed out the Rings of Power, 9 to mortal men and 7 to the kings of each of the dwarven clans. The 9 produced the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, Sauron's greatest servants, whereas the 7 Sauron considered as failures and he attempted to reclaim them, succeeding with 3 of them. Yet Sauron didn't just reclaim the 7. From most accounts, he also reclaimed the 9 from the Nazgul. In this video, let's ask the question, why did Sauron take the rings from the Nazgul? So sometime after the War of the Elves and Sauron, Sauron handed out the 16 Rings of Power he had taken from the Elves during the sack of Eregion. 7 ended up with the kings of the 7 dwarven clans, whereas the 9 ended up with men of various stature and race, and they would go on to become great kings, warriors, and sorcerers. Unfortunately for them, the rings came with some major side effects. It prolonged their lives until they had stretched out so much that they had physically faded. Then, they became wraiths, enslaved to the power of the One Ring, which was held by Sauron. But at some point in the Third Age, Sauron seems to have taken the 9 from the Nazgul. While at the Council of Elrond, Gandalf does say that the Nazgul keep the 9, but at other points, it's stated that Sauron has taken the 9 from the Nazgul. When discovering Frodo had the One Ring, Gandalf contradicts his later statement and says that Sauron has gathered the 9 to himself. At the Mirror of Galadriel, Galadriel says something similar, saying that Sauron now holds the 7 and the 9, although she's partly mistaken as Sauron only holds 3 of the 7. And finally, in the Hunt for the Ring in the Unfinished Tales, it's also stated that Sauron holds the 9. Gandalf's statement at the Council of Elrond seems to have been an error that Tolkien never went back and corrected. On top of that, there's also physical evidence that suggests that the Nazgul no longer held their Rings of Power. At Weathertop, Frodo sees the Nazgul as clearly as one could see them while wearing the One Ring, and he even gets a good look at the Witch King's hand, where he does not see a Ring of Power. Likewise, when the Witch King is destroyed at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, there is no Ring of Power found on his body, if you could call it that. So I'd say we have enough evidence, both verbal and physical, that the Nazgul did not carry their Rings of Power, at least at the end of the Third Age. We're not told how certain characters know that Sauron had regathered the 9 to himself. With someone like Galadriel, it's possible that she used her mirror to find out. It's also possible that the Nazgul had been seen enough times by this point, never with a Ring of Power, for people to deduce that Sauron must have taken them back, much like he did to the Dwarven Rings. The question is, why? Well, the reason is actually quite simple. Sauron no longer holds the One Ring. What you must remember is that all of the other Rings of Power, including the Elven 3, were subservient to the One Ring. Elves did not wear the 3, while Sauron had the 1. Dwarves were resistant to domination and were therefore able to avoid being enslaved, but men, the wearers of the 9, became enslaved to Sauron because he was wielding the One Ring. It basically created a backdoor in which he could dominate them, much like he intended for the elves before they became aware of his plan. But without the One Ring, Sauron no longer wields that mind control device over the Nazgul. That doesn't mean that they're suddenly free, they're still enslaved to his powerful will, but what it does mean is that if, for example, someone else managed to master the One Ring, they could theoretically use it to wrest control of the Nazgul from Sauron. This would require someone very powerful, someone like Gandalf or Saruman, or at least on the level of Galadriel, Elrond, or Círdan. So by taking the rings from the Nazgul, Sauron was basically creating an insurance policy. Firstly, the Nazgul were already completely bound to their rings, much like Gollum was, so taking it from their person wouldn't destroy them. Secondly, while he didn't have the One Ring, Sauron could at least use the 9 to control the Nazgul directly. In Letter 246, Tolkien actually goes over a hypothetical scenario where Frodo was successful in claiming the One Ring as his own, and points out that he would not have been able to control the Nazgul with the One Ring, as Sauron had primary control over them through the 9. While the Nazgul would not have been able to harm Frodo due to his use of the One Ring, they still wouldn't have obeyed his orders because his will wasn't capable of matching Sauron's. Basically, as long as Sauron held the 9, the Nazgul were his, unless, as I said earlier, someone was powerful enough to use the One Ring effectively. In that case, they might have been able to dominate the Nazgul. But at this point, this would be the least of Sauron's problems. If someone was powerful enough to directly contest his will, then they might have been able to completely master the One Ring, and if that happened, it would be the same for Sauron as if it was destroyed. He would be destroyed. Without the One Ring, it was beneficial for Sauron to take the other rings out of circulation because now they could actually be feasibly used against him. As I stated earlier, he already considered the Seven a failure, which is why he invested a lot of time and effort in retrieving them. Sure, they helped bring ruin upon the dwarves in some ways, but they also helped the dwarves to build a vast amount of wealth, which could be detrimental to Sauron's plans. For example, the dwarves of Erebor and the Men of Dale creating a powerful bulwark in the north against Sauron's forces was largely thanks to the wealth the dwarves had acquired, wealth that their rings had helped them acquire. Sauron possibly feared something similar with the Nine. Sure, the Nazgul held them, but as we saw with the Witch King, the Nazgul could be destroyed. If the fallen Nazgul dropped a Ring of Power, that could also be used against Sauron. While not as powerful as the One Ring, these rings could still allow their users to gather great amounts of power, the Nazgul being perfect examples of that. Powerful sorcerers, kings, and warriors during their lives. When Sauron still had the One Ring, this wouldn't have been a huge concern to him, because the next wielder of the ring would just end up enslaved to him too. But we're not sure that this would happen if Sauron did not possess the One Ring. If someone like Aragorn or even Boromir used one of the Nine, they could do a great amount of damage against Sauron. Sure, it would inevitably corrupt them, but that doesn't mean they would serve or side with Sauron. They would also turn into wraiths on account of the life-extending side effects, but once again, that doesn't mean they would become a wraith in service to Sauron. They might become like a rogue Wraith King, which is something Sauron really wouldn't want to have to deal with. So it makes sense why Sauron quietly repossessed the Nine from his most powerful servants. There was literally no benefit in the Nazgul running around with their rings of power. It didn't help him, and as far as we know, it didn't help them. Instead, there were a lot of potential consequences. The Nazgul could potentially be taken control of by someone else if they were powerful enough to use the One Ring. Alternatively, a Nazgul could die in battle, lose their ring, and that same ring could then be used against Sauron. Funnily enough, while Sauron couldn't comprehend that someone would want to destroy the One Ring, he certainly did put a lot of thought and effort into making sure none of the rings could be used against him. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I would like to say that we don't get a definitive answer for many of Sauron's motivations, because we never really receive his point of view. However, we know that he had a lot of fear and doubt, even for someone so powerful, so it's reasonable to assume that they motivated actions such as these. I haven't done a shout out to my patrons in a while. I'd like to thank all previous patrons too. The current ones are Steve B, Tap, Alex Ebbett, Carrot Ifson, MNCB10, Thunderstriken, Mo L, Mojtaba Rowe, Catherine Berry, Stone Truck, Slowbro96, Gavin, Happy Mana, Fipse, Andrew Welch, James Mottram, Will Harrison, W. Sean Mason, Jiv, Halamar Rathlon, BRN, Vasco Serpinto, and Ben Jeffrey. If you'd like to support the channel, the link is in the description, but as always, no pressure. Cheers, farewell, and remember, not only was Sauron a horrible slave master, he didn't even let the Nazgul keep their toys.